The Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and your local cable provider presents Cable Reports. Join us now as Cable Reports brings you up to date on current issues facing the Commonwealth through discussions with your local legislators and other policymakers from across Virginia.
From the General Assembly and the City of Richmond, I'm Woody Evans for Cable Reports and Cox Communications, connecting Virginians to their government. We are pleased to have two members of the Newport News delegation with us. Senator John Miller, good to see you, sir.
Good to be back with you, Woody.
Delegate Monty Mason, welcome.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate you having me.
One of the new members of the House of Delegates. Tell us how it's going.
It's going well. I'm really enjoying it. It's a frenetic pace. I mean, and I think that's the part that I like the most, is that you never know that when someone knocks on your door in your office, you don't know who they are and what they're coming in to talk about. But they've got an issue, they've got a position that they're trying to educate you, and it's a lot of fun digesting it all and trying to turn it into something productive.
And you've had some success already. You've moved up in seniority, as I understand.
I'm rolling along. As Senator Lewis, I think, maybe moved me up another seat. So, but yes, sir, I started in '94 through a draw, and now I'm 93 and also represent the 93rd District. I guess ultimately I'll land at 92 by the end of the year. So.
Great. And your committee assignments, talk to us about them.
I got very fortunate on my committee assignments for a freshman, I believe. I was assigned to the Courts of Justice Committee, which is a lot of work, very voluminous legislation. Maybe here's more bills than certainly any other committee, but a lot of them combined. I got assigned to the criminal subcommittee as well as judicial appointments, and as a non-lawyer, I really have to do extra work to make sure I understand, because there's a lot of reference to code sections, so I have to look things up and cross-reference, but it's been a lot of fun and very educational. We also handle some very tough and great issues, and so it's a great importance. I also got assigned to county, cities, and towns, which is good for me because I have a background working with local governments as the chairman of the Economic Development Authority in Williamsburg. So there are a lot of important things that come through there for our localities. And, you know, in talking to the folks back home, it's really important not to put too much burden on them because they already carry a lot of responsibility.
And this is your first elected office. Tell us why and how you got involved in politics.
It's interesting. I've been a follower and a fan of the Virginia General Assembly all my life, going back to growing up. I had a friend whose father was here for 18 years and did some model General Assembly work, and the legislative process was always my interest in William and Mary, and so the district was very solid. I moved back to Williamsburg 10 years ago with my wife, who works at the college, and so it's a true honor to have the opportunity to represent my alma mater and the people of Newport News, Williamsburg, James City County, and York.
And you have a background in business. You're an executive with Visa.
Yes, sir. I currently work for Visa in the fraud and risk area. I worked for Land America Lawyers Title in real estate transactions for a number of years, and then even with Xerox out of college. So I am undergraduate only and with a business background and business focus, and so I enjoy looking at economic development opportunities and business opportunities through the lens of state government.
Senator Miller, I see that there was quite a heated debate yesterday in the Senate, but now you are finally organized. Tell us about the reorganization and your committee assignments.
Well, for the first 2 years in the Senate, Woody, as you know, there were 20 Republicans, 20 Democrats, and a Republican lieutenant governor, which gave the Republicans the opportunity to control the Senate. Now there are 20 Democrats and 20 Republicans, but a Democratic lieutenant governor. So yesterday we had several hour-long debate and maneuvering about changing the rules of the Senate and assuming power on the Democratic side and making new committee assignments. So the committee assignments came out, and I'm very pleased to continue on working in the Education and Health Committee, and I will become the chairman of the Public Education Subcommittee, so all legislation dealing with K-12 issues will come through that subcommittee. And I'll continue on Agriculture and Natural Resources Committee and Local Government. And then I've picked up 2 new committees, which I served on in my first 4 years in the Senate: Transportation, which is vitally important to the Peninsula and Hampton Roads, and also on General Laws.
Well, thank you for being here, because if my math is correct, that's 5 committees.
That's 5 committees. There are 3 senators that have 5 committees, and I'm one of them. But they're great committees, and it really gives me an opportunity to have significant input in many of the major issues that face the Commonwealth.
So your constituents in Newport News must be happy with the news that you have those very powerful committees and that subcommittee now.
Well, the subcommittee for sure is very important to me. That education has been my #1 issue and my passion. And so this will put me in a position where I can really help shape things like SOLs and education policy.
Tell us a little bit about Newport News, the district you represent, geography, diversity, the economy.
Well, it is very artfully drawn, the district. It starts in Suffolk, 1 precinct in Suffolk, and then comes across the river and goes up Newport News from the river to Warwick Boulevard until you get to Mercury Boulevard, and then it sort of widens out and takes most of all of Newport News. And 2.5 precincts in Hampton, and then when you get to the northern end of Newport News, it very cleverly picks its way through parts of James City County and York County to get to Williamsburg. And so it cries out for the need for bipartisan redistricting. We ought not to have the folks who have a stake in the outcome draw on those lines. They ought to be drawn by people who have common sense and no stake in the outcome. So hopefully, I've got legislation. As you know, I put in legislation every year to create a bipartisan redistricting commission. This year, I'm taking a little different tack and calling for a non-binding advisory referendum on the November ballot. And let's let the people speak as to whether they want to create a bipartisan redistricting commission or not. I think 95% of the people would vote yes on that. So that will come up in the Senate in the next week or two, and hopefully that'll pass.
So, Delegate Mason, the citizens or constituents should pick the members of the House and the Senate versus the members of the House and the Senate picking their district.
I believe that very much.
Go ahead.
Well, I think the senator is right. He and I have overlapping districts and a lot of overlapping interests as well. And I've looked to his advice and counsel along the way to this point on education matters, but redistricting is one that I truly believe. If we redistricted a more compact zone, it may actually be to my, it would not necessarily be to my benefit, but I am a full supporter because I believe that we should have, we had, what, 67 districts this year that were uncontested. That's not how we get the best and the brightest. We need people competing in solid elections to get here. So we have the best minds and the best representation for the people here.
What drives the economy in Newport News? It's known for shipbuilding. We have the military, but tell us what needs to be done to continue growth and economic development.
It's a great, we have to diversify our economy on the Virginia Peninsula, period, whether it's tourism in the northern part of my district or the reliance on the military and the shipyards in the southern. Those are great economic engines that we have to continue to support and make sure they thrive. But we have to look for other opportunities for small businesses. We've done a lot of incentive work for the arts in the northern part of the district. But in Newport News particularly, we have a lot of military that if we can work hard to maintain them when they finish their service, these are well-trained, highly disciplined men and women that we can put in place, but we need economic opportunity for them. And, you know, the transportation measures that the Senator just discussed, it's great having him back on that committee because obviously we took a good first step in transportation, alleviating some congestion. I also have a Peninsula Corridor transit study that I've asked for to look at high-capacity guide lanes. You know, does light rail work on the Virginia Peninsula? Do high-capacity bus lanes work on the Virginia Peninsula? The City of Newport News reached out to me, and 85% of the time, mass transit in Newport News is on time. Well, that's not bad unless you're looking at the other side of that. 15% of the time, either that employee's not getting to work on time, that employer can't depend on his workforce getting there properly, and or that just throws the reliability into question. So hopefully a study will help shore up that type of thing to increase our reliance on transit, so to remove some congestion off of our road.
And of course, our veterans, which he just spoke about, need a lot of help, especially those who are returning from the theaters of war. And I know you've been involved in a veterans diversion program.
Yeah, Hampton has been a leader in that, working with the VA hospital in Hampton and the CSBs. You know, a lot of times people are returning, and a high percentage of folks from the military in Afghanistan and from Iraq came back with post-traumatic stress or are coming back. And sometimes when they have that condition, they forget to take their medicine and end up in the criminal justice system. And that's not where they need to be. They need to get treatment. And so Hampton has a great program where they can divert members of the military, retired or active, from the criminal justice system into a program where they'll get the help that they need through the CSBs or the VA.
Now, I noticed that the transportation funding measure is under some attack, at least in terms of hybrid cars. Tell us, I think that's already passed, if my memory
It has passed the Senate. I had a bill eliminating the $64 tax. It was so as did several other senators, and they rolled it all into one bill. But what bothered me about it was that we were taxing hybrid cars. Now, there are several gasoline cars, about half a dozen, that get better mileage than a hybrid does. So why aren't we taxing them? It just wasn't fair to pick out a type of car and slap a tax on it. We're asking people to conserve gas, to reduce our dependence on foreign oil, and they do that by driving a hybrid, and then we tax them for doing the right thing. It just didn't make any sense.
Now, I believe it was only intended to raise about $7 million compared to $1 billion a year. But there's another provision, the market that is contingent upon Congress passing the Marketplace Freedom Act, which would allow states like the Commonwealth to tax those out-of-state retailers who provide goods and services on the internet. What happens if Congress does not pass that?
Well, I don't think Congress will. It's been in Congress for about a decade, and they haven't passed it yet, and so I don't think they will. But what we did when we wrote the transportation funding package last year, the governor insisted that portion of it be in there as a funding mechanism. But those of us who realize that may not happen also wrote in a provision saying that if it doesn't happen by a certain date, then the tax at the wholesale level will go up by a corresponding amount to cover that funds that wouldn't come from Washington passing the tax.
I know you have a number of seniors in your district, and there's legislation dealing with computer fraud in relation to seniors that you are sponsoring this year.
Yes, sir. I've tried to focus on seniors are particularly vulnerable, whether it's phishing, calling on the phone, offering these opportunities, or computers, because they have the access to the computer technology as they should, but they haven't necessarily grown up with it. And so they seem to be very vulnerable to a lot of these scams. Click here and for only $129 we'll clean up your computer, and that gives people the opportunity to get in and put bots and devices on the computer. So that's one thing that I tried to focus on, particularly just the fine element of it. It would raise a year, which may make it difficult to get past because it puts an extra year of jail time on, but it also raises the fine from $25,000 to $100,000. There's one thing Senator Miller touched on that I wanted to go back to. He was talking about the people coming back from war with conditions. You know, we've worked closely with Gabe Morgan in the Sheriff's Department, and our constitutional officers in Newport News and in other localities are under a great deal of pressure because in the Sheriff's condition, they tend to be the front line for us on mental health and on places, people that are struggling with treatable conditions, but they end up in our jails. But some of their deputies are extraordinarily low paid. The Commissioner of Revenue was in my office yesterday. Some of their lower employees, lower level from a pay standpoint employees, but serve incredible need in calculations and funding and figuring out what we're doing with our money. They're spending a constant time training because we're not paying them an acceptable wage. I think that's something in Newport News that we need to work on and make sure that we get the funding for their employees because of the level that we require that employee to focus on. We've got to come up with funding to figure out how to make that work.
And of course, Senator, some of those law enforcement low-level employees are the people we look to when we have to detain those who may be a danger to themselves or others. And of course, one of your colleagues suffered a real tragedy recently. And mental health reform is back with us.
Well, Senator Deeds has really put a face on mental health reform and is using that tragic situation to make some very needed improvements. We are spending less on mental health today than we were after Virginia Tech, when we poured millions of dollars in try and correct that situation. While we were pouring it in to solve Virginia Tech, we were taking it away from the CSPs. We really do need to focus on mental health, and I think this session will, because of the tragedy that Senator Deeds has. But as Delegate Mason has pointed out, about a third of the people in our jails have mental illness problems, and about 25% of them serious mental problems. Jails are not the place where we ought to be holding these folks. They need to get treatment, and as we continue to close down institutions across the state, we've got to ensure that there are community availabilities where they can get the treatment that they need. Unfortunately, that hadn't happened.
Delegate Mason, I believe you have a bill dealing with emergency court orders, the need to detain people against their will for a longer period of time.
Yes, sir. There's an emergency custody order measure that leads to the temporary detention. But, you know, and in sitting through the ethics hearing on Friday afternoon, Chairman Albo was very interested to find that the clock starts ticking when you apprehend, when you take the person into custody. So you only have 6 hours and a 2-hour extension there. So I hope that there'll be some movement, and he seemed to be interested towards getting the clock to start when you get someone to a proper treatment facility. Senator Miller makes a great point. First of all, we have to find those places because the jails are not it. They tend to be the emergency rooms now. But if we could find and fund drop-off centers where we could take people to a facility that has security and has treatment and has people that can analyze, then the local law enforcement could be removed and they begin getting the treatment they need almost immediately. That would help the stress that goes on that only 8 that we're trying to extend to a 10-hour window. Because you have to have the facility written on the jacket that they're going to. So I hope there's some common sense adjustments we can make, all the while keeping the rights of the patient or the person in mind, not a long extended period, but getting them the help we need. We have to start understanding that mental health is a disease, and not unlike, and not to be flippant, not unlike high blood pressure, that if treated, you can live a normal, capable life. But you need to make sure the treatment is there, it's properly diagnosed, and the parameters around continually taking medications, whether it's people checking and making sure that goes on. It's a multifaceted problem, but we've got to stop waiting until we see it in the headlines to do something about it.
Senator, I know your interest continues in social services and rehabilitation, even though you're no longer on that committee. And there is a lingering implementation of the Department of Justice settlement that has provided a lot of angst to elderly parents whose sons and daughters have been institutionalized, and now they're going to be transitioned to a community-based facility. Talk to us about what's going on there.
Well, the Department of Justice has come in, and there was a settlement, as you mentioned, and part of that settlement is the creation of many more waivers to get people the help that they need. And I think we added about 250 a year, which doesn't quite keep up with the need, but it does put us on a step in the right direction. But there has been a movement, as you know, across the Commonwealth to close down the training centers, and the only one that is supposed to be left open is the one in Chesapeake, and that's downsized to about 65 beds. The folks in Northern Virginia where there's a training center, Lynchburg where there's a training center, are very dead set against closing that down because there are not in the community the facilities to put these people and have them receive the type of care that they're getting in the training center. So in the next few weeks, there are several bills moving through that will address this issue and whether or not we have to shut them down. The judge in the Department of Justice case said you do not have to shut down all the training centers, and so I think they're looking at that interpretation to say that we can keep some of them open and be able to provide the services that these people need. And some people are just our most vulnerable citizens may not be comfortable in a community setting and may need a training center setting to really help them continue on.
Let's turn to public education. I know you've been a leader in terms of ensuring that by the third grade, students can read, write, and do basic arithmetic, because there's some real negative consequences if they don't. Tell us about that.
Well, the negative consequences, Woody, and the third grade reading test is the most predictive test we have. If a student passes that third grade test, there's a 95% chance they'll pass the fifth grade and they'll be successful. But if they fail, there's a 50% chance they're going to fail the fifth grade test and they will fail school. And so we have a pipeline of thousands of children every year that are going to fail school unless we can get them to read at the third grade level in the third grade. And so one of the things that we can do to help do that is to eliminate 2 SOLs in the third grade. Virginia is one of only 5 states that give 4 tests, high-stake SOL tests at the end of the year. Reading and math, history and science. And these are cumulative tests. They test a knowledge from kindergarten through third grade. So a third grader is tested on more knowledge than they'll ever be tested on in the rest of their academic career.
No wonder my granddaughter complains about it so much.
And it really, you know, when you're 10 years old and you've got these high-stake tests, there's a lot of pressure. JLARC did a study, and they said one thing we can do, which would save money and improve test scores, is to concentrate on reading and math in the third grade. We're still going to teach history. We're still going to teach science. We're still going to test it. We're just not going to have a high-stakes test at the end of the year. And the time that is spent teaching to the test and those other subjects, we can spend in trying to improve third grade reading test scores. Here's how serious the situation is. 2 years ago, we gave the third grade reading test score to every third grader. 37 schools in the Commonwealth could not get 75% of the class to pass. Wow. 37. We toughened the test up last year, as we should. Made it harder, made the kids think more. Instead of 37 schools, 604 cannot get 75%.
604.
604, more than half the elementary schools in the Commonwealth can't get 3/4 of the class to pass. That's a crisis. So we've got to do something, and the easiest thing to do, and I think the smartest, is to concentrate in the third grade on reading and math. Those are the 2 core subjects they're going to need to be successful for the rest of their academic career. You know, we want to make sure that the kids can read the history books, can read the science books, and you do that in the third grade.
But less focus on memorization, more focus on critical analysis.
Multidisciplinary, assessment-based learning. I mean, and the Senator, I couldn't agree more with his work and effort. And we have to emphasize that just because we're reducing the number doesn't mean that to teach to read, we're not teaching about Jamestown and what happened in 1619. Just because we're teaching math or testing to math doesn't mean we're not incorporating science into the math problems. So there's no effort to leave those aside. It's just to focus on making sure that our children can read at that level and do the math at that level. And then as we look to eliminate other tests and reduce the numbers, you know, the assessment-based criteria. I've worked closely with Rob Kropico on the House side, who's also working with Tad Greason in the SOL reform, to try to make it a bipartisan effort to, rather than teaching just to the memorization or the multiple choice, the opportunity to the famine in Jamestown of the summer. You know, that is an agricultural discussion, that's a climate discussion, that's a sociological discussion. So there are many things that you can weave into that to teach the story, to tell the story, and then to have the children learn multiple things and assess their learning accordingly.
2 other matters, one of which you mentioned earlier, the 8F grading, but also what reactions did you get during your campaign, or that you still get, in terms of the state's authority now to take over failing schools?
That was not received well at all. I don't think that makes a lot of sense. I understand the frustration, but from the A to F, assigning a single letter grade to a school makes no sense. The Senator and I toured an elementary school. They give a test for children with disabilities. The statewide average passing is 41%. They were 71%. Then the test changed, and they were 68%. Well, as the percentages, they fell 5% more, even though the numbers don't seem it. Because they fell 5% year to year. Now, remember, different children, different disabilities, different year. Because they fell more than 5%, that school can receive no more than a C rating, despite the fact that they overachieved the state average by 30%. So it just shows you that the formula on A through F doesn't completely make sense. It doesn't take socioeconomic conditions into sense. There's been some great work by Mark Lindbergh, a superintendent in Western Virginia, comparing his school to a school in Northern Virginia. They got almost identical grades. The Falls Church School had the number of people living in poverty at that school. He had almost that same number of homeless students in his school. So it really is an apples to oranges situation. And as far as the takeover of schools go, you know, I understand that just throwing money at schools that have struggled for long periods of time is not the answer. But I don't believe a centralized structure here in Richmond taking over schools and then taking the monies from the localities to fund that makes any sense. And I also question the constitutionality.
What about helping those students who want to go to the UVAs of the world, so to speak? I mean, tuition costs have skyrocketed over the last 10 years. There is as much student debt I have read recently as there was in the housing crisis at one time. So how do we help those students?
Well, the General Assembly has to make higher education a priority. And we underfund it by $1 billion every year. And that is forcing universities to do two things: either raise their tuition or bring more out-of-state students who pay 3 times as much and pay full freight. But every time you bring in somebody from out of state, you're denying a Virginian the opportunity to go to class. So, you know, we've got to ensure that we fund higher education properly, and right now we're not doing that. And the only recourse that colleges and universities have is to keep raising rates.
And of course, junior colleges play a tremendous role in educating our students and our adults
and our workforce, and they are key. And I think this governor he's very proud of saying he's visited every single community college in Virginia and sees the importance to workforce development, and I think you'll see a greater emphasis on that in this administration.
Now, what about those students who complete high school but say, hey, I don't want to go to junior college, I don't want to go to an institution of higher learning? What about more of an emphasis on vocational education?
We really need to focus on the workforce development element. And the Virginia Chamber of Commerce's Blueprint Virginia's manual recently, or report, has shown it starts with education, the importance of early childhood education and education K through 12, but then it really focuses on workforce development. We've got a lot of jobs in Newport News, in the shipyard, that go unfilled because of lack of qualified and trained workers. So we have to, but it's almost a mindset in Virginia and in America that my child has to go to college, because if they don't, they're going to get behind. Well, what if we give them solid workforce training, vocational, skilled, highly skilled and technical training? I was traveling for business to Omaha, and they cannot find mechanics for these big diesel trucks, because the concept is the grease monkey of the past. This is a highly technical, laptop, computer-driven, mechanically oriented and mathematically oriented skill. It's not the old days of changing the oil in the truck. It is really high tech that pays very well. But we have to change our mindset towards saying, here are job opportunities that we have. Here are the skills and the technological understanding that you need to get them. Marry the two together and try to find employment.
Well, thank you both for being here. We don't have enough time to discuss a lot of the issues pending before the General Assembly, but good luck, Senator John Miller and Delegate Monty Mason.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Thank you for watching Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and Cox Communications, connecting Virginians to their government. Until next time, I'm Woody Evans.